thank you all for joining us. There are about 2,000 people who are registered for this Zoom call and are currently coming on. An extra special thank you to all our South Florida elected officials, not only for taking the time to participate in this important virtual briefing, but for speaking out so strongly in support of Israel and in opposition to anti-Semitism. When the fighting broke out between Israel and Hamas, every elected official on this call, Republicans and Democrats alike, spoke out very strongly in support of Israel and against terrorist rocket fire. We are truly grateful to have your unwavering support and to have you with us here today. Additionally, thank you to all the community sponsors of this event: the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the Jewish Federation of Broward County, the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, and the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the Israeli Consulate in Miami, and the Rabbinic Association of Greater Miamis. As always, we truly appreciate your partnership. As I mentioned, I'm speaking to you live from Tel Aviv. I'm here participating in a Jewish Federation. It's incredibly meaningful for me personally to be here at this time. This morning, we visited Iron Dome Battery as well as Ashkelon and saw one of the homes that was destroyed by Hamas rockets. While supporting Israel's in Israel, as you know, in the wake of the fighting, the number of violent anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish people, many of which are disguised as Palestinian solidarity, are increasingly dramatically in cities all over the world, including several instances in South Florida. This is not a town hall addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a town hall addressing the conflict between Israel and Hamas and other terrorist activities, who recently fired 4,000 rockets at half of the world's Jewish population with the sole aim at indiscriminately murdering Jewish civilians. While I stand fervently for Israel, I'm also sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinian people. It's a shame that they are governed by a violent extremist organization that so overtly exploits its citizens. One last thing. I mentioned a short while ago the strong bipartisan support for Israel from our elected officials. In this current hyper-partisan world, fighting anti-Semitism and supporting Israel are two of the rare issues that unify our South Florida Jewish community. This is a nonpartisan issue for the Jewish community. For elected officials who are speaking on this town hall, we really respectfully request that you refrain from framing the issue in a partisan manner. We all know that we Jews have many opinions, but we are overwhelmingly united when it comes to support and affection for Israel from both sides of the political aisle, and we are so appreciative of that support from both sides. Thank you for strengthening the unity of the Jewish community around a cause that we care so much about. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'll now pass it over to this afternoon's MC, Jacob Solomon, our president and CEO of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Ike. I bet you 3/4 of the people on this call wish they were right there with you in your hotel room, but thanks for representing us at this important time. I also want to join Ike in thanking our co-sponsoring organizations and our fellow South Florida federations. I'm going to be very brief. Our first speaker may get called away for a vote at any point, so I want to get into the program as quickly as we can. I just want to echo Ike's words of thanks to our congressional delegation, our senators. Every one of you has been just great allies and friends, and we are so appreciative, and we welcome you to this virtual room. A word about our format. We're going to be hearing from representatives of our organizations who will also be introducing several of our speakers. Some of our speakers went out of their ways to arrange their schedules, so some may be coming and going. So they've asked us to be a little bit flexible. So I'm asking our panelists to stay on your toes. And if we have to move things around, we'll do that in order to accommodate our speakers. And to our audience, you'll see that we may go out of order in terms of seniority or protocol. It's only to accommodate our wonderful panelists. I do want to note for everyone that we're joined this afternoon by multiple television and print media personnel, and that the program is being recorded. One more word, and then we're going to get to our first speaker. It's a long word, but it's an important one. When we first envisioned this program, we thought, obviously naively, that it would be of extreme importance to give people an opportunity to engage live with our elected officials. And our original intention was to have an open forum with real-time comments in the chat window and questions. However, as we consulted with various people who have attempted to organize these kinds of programs, what we heard just broke our heart, frankly, and it caused us to change directions on the format. They shared with us that the chat window is immediately overtaken by vitriol, demonization, obscenities, and yeah, even threats. So it may have been a painful but constructive opportunity to see that kind of hate being expressed in its full and abhorrent form. We determined that it would be terribly unfair to our speakers, A, because it would distract people's attention from our speaker's important message, but it would also subject them, and they are our guests this afternoon, to abusive behavior. And this is a tragic and sad commentary on the state of civil discourse in our society, but reluctantly, we did not feel like we had a real choice. So please forgive this change in format and understand why we made that decision. Let me, with no further ado, introduce our first speaker. With great pleasure, I want to introduce Governor and Senator Rick Scott, who has been a true champion of the U.S.-Israel relationships. He's been to Israel several times. We had a mission who met with him there. One time I remember he signed anti-boycott, divestment, and sanctions legislation as governor, and recently speaking out forcefully and unequivocally in defense of Israel's right to defend herself against Hamas rockets. As a member of the Homeland Security and Armed Services Committees, Senator Scott is overseeing critical legislation for Israel's security today, and we're very grateful for his leadership and for making himself available to us this afternoon. Senator Scott, thank you and welcome.
First off, I just want to thank everybody on today. Jacob, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody on today. That all of us are in the same position. We're going to do everything we can to defend Israel's right to defend itself, and we're going to call Hamas exactly what it is. It's a terrorist organization. And I will do everything I can to be helpful. I've had, as Jacob said, I had the opportunity to go to Israel. I had the opportunity to actually see exactly where Hezbollah is, Hamas, ISIS, and it's you know, your heart goes out to the families and the individuals in Israel. You hear the stories of like a little 5-year-old that was killed by a Hamas rocket last week. That it means disgusting. So what we did so far is I did a resolution with 30 of my colleagues. It was very similar to the resolution that was done in 2014 to say we're going to defend Israel and we are going to call out Hamas for what it is, a terrorist organization. 30 of my colleagues signed on. Unfortunately, it was blocked, but we're going to keep working to fight for Israel. I'm also doing a bill that was going to make sure that there's no taxpayer dollars that are going to go to fund Hamas terrorists, and I'm hopeful that all of my colleagues will support that. I've done a resolution with Senator Cruz to approve arms sales to Israel. We've got to make sure that all the resources that were expended in the Iron Dome as a result of the thousands of Hamas rockets are replenished. And we've also seen, unfortunately, the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel actions in Congress and the United States. And I've joined with Senator Hawley to condemn that. So we got to stand up. Anytime we see anybody dealing with anti-Semitism, I watched this when I was governor. We had to deal with it in our university system, and it was disgusting. Have to deal with the BDS movement. And you just can't make this stuff up. So I'm going to do whatever I can. If anybody has any ideas of things that I need to be doing to provide more support to Israel, just let me know and I will do it. Israel's a great democracy, one of our greatest allies, our best ally in the Middle East. And they're, like the United States, a beacon for hope and light. So Jacob, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and let me know what I can do to be helpful.
Thank you, Senator Scott. I am Mark Friedman, the interim president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Broward County. I want to thank Senator Scott for demonstrating his deep friendship and enduring support for the state of Israel. Current events remind us that any attempt to delegitimize Israel, deny her right to exist, or roll back her ability to defend herself is patently anti-Semitic and completely unacceptable. And sadly, today we are witnessing that many Jews no longer feel safe on college campuses, cafes, and restaurants, and in their places of worship. We said yesterday in a statement released jointly by the Jewish Federation and the Broward Board of Rabbis, today we speak with a united voice, urging leaders in government, faith-based institutions on college campuses and beyond to take concrete, measurable, and decisive steps to combat the alarming rise of anti-Semitism. We are all aware that there is an ongoing debate about how to deal with our nation's crumbling infrastructure. And now we find ourselves confronted with an alarming growing infrastructure of hatred in our society. We can and we must address this now. Anti-Semitism is unfortunately at the forefront of this matrix of hate, and our political leadership, in partnership with faith-based and nonprofit civic organizations and corporate America, must come together in a bipartisan effort to tackle this burgeoning issue before it devolves to the point where hateful behaviors and actions become an uncontrollable cancer plaguing our society and tearing at the fabric of our social compact. We must do this not only for our sake, but for the future welfare of our children and our grandchildren. And I want to thank our good friend, Congressman Ted Deutsch, who is already leading the charge in taking on these tough challenges in his role as co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism. And this now brings me to the introduction of our next speaker, Congressman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Over the past 15 years, representing us in Congress, Congressman Wasserman Schultz has been an outspoken advocate for Israel and for our local Jewish community. We are grateful for her strong statements and her recent speech on the House floor supporting Israel and denouncing anti-Semitism. And we are especially proud of her role on the Appropriations Committee to secure funding for Iron Dome. I would also note her leadership as co-chair of the Black Jewish Congressional Caucus. On Monday, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, along with her colleagues Brenda Lawrence and Lee Zeldin, released a forceful bipartisan statement condemning the alarming rise of violent anti-Semitic attacks in the United States, and including some, unfortunately, in our own home in South Florida. Now, more than ever, it is important to combat anti-Semitism by engaging with historical allies who are outside the Jewish community. Simply put, we are stronger together. Please welcome Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you so much, Mark. And let me just say, welcome to Broward. Welcome back to South Florida, and we're really thrilled and fortunate to have your leadership as we begin to steer the Broward Jewish Federation forward into the future. Look forward to working with you once again. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you for that kind introduction. And just note how important it is that we come together today to declare our unwavering and steadfast support for the state of Israel. I know I welcome the mutually agreed ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the relief that will bring from the pain and suffering that Israeli and Palestinian civilians endured during the past 10 days that was caused, make no mistake, by the bombardment of Hamas rockets into Israel. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are single-handedly responsible for the escalation that has led to the bloodshed of Israelis and Palestinians. These terrorist organizations do not care about people or peace. They have one objective. They seek only to destroy the Jewish state. And like every sovereign nation, Israel has every right to defend herself from these terrorists. The leadership and loyalty of President Biden, who stood by our democratic ally Israel, is deeply appreciated. The president's constructive diplomacy and continued commitment to the Iron Dome ensures Israel's right to defend herself against terror attacks. Without the Iron Dome air defense system, the loss of life would have been far worse than the nightmare before us today. Supporting Israel, who is our strongest and most reliable ally in the region, means dedication to her security and maintaining her qualitative edge, including a strong defense against varied threats. Congress must ensure the life-saving missile defense systems continue to get the support and funding needed to keep civilians safe. One of my top priorities is the security of the democratic Jewish state of Israel. Since 1948, when the United States became the first country to recognize the newly established state, a strongly unified US Congress has always stood by her side as a strong ally and friend. And today it's clear that is more important than ever. My most recent visit to Israel was in November of 2019, when I had the privilege of leading a bipartisan congressional delegation of women members of Congress. On one day, we traversed all the way from a kibbutz, 1 kilometer from the border with Gaza, to the borders with Syria and Lebanon. When you stand at Israel's borders, you come to understand the country's vulnerability in a new light. You see with your own eyes the bomb shelters and are able to calculate the seconds or minutes, if you're lucky, it takes for a rocket to hit a civilian home. And as we saw just last week, these are not abstract issues. This is the reality that every Israeli grapples with. Unfortunately, while safety remains a concern for so many in Israel, it's a concern here at home. In the past 2 weeks, we have seen a significant rise in anti-Semitism. Jews have been attacked on public streets, been spat upon and assaulted, and had their synagogues vandalized. The uptick in my district alone is beyond disturbing. The so-called Goyim Defense League rallied outside the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center in Dania Beach, chanting profanity-laced rhetoric. A Jewish family from New Jersey was visiting Bal Harbor when 4 men drove by and hurled anti-Semitic slurs and actual garbage at them. And if all that wasn't enough, a man went into an anti-Semitic rant directed at a rabbi outside the Chabad of South Broward and Hallandale Beach, and then proceeded to dump a bag of human feces on the synagogue's doorstep. This must stop. I stand for free speech and the historic American right to assemble and protest the policies of our country or any other country. But leaders throughout our country must clearly, firmly, and forcefully denounce and condemn the alarming rise in rampant hate, violence, and harassment targeting Jewish Americans. When I say that America unequivocally and unconditionally stands by our key and our most dependable democratic ally, Israel, we have to demonstrate that with actions as well as words. Words are nice. Actions mean so much more. I pray for peace and security in the region and mourn the loss of all lives, Israeli and Palestinian. And I urge the continued cessation of all intentional acts of violence and a return to working towards a viable 2-state solution. Everyone deserves to live in peace, free from terrorism. Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, for your inspired and longtime leadership and for being an important voice in Congress. We're grateful for your moral courage and standing against anti-Semitism. I was proud to be on a panel that you convened earlier this week to celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month and Asian American Heritage Month, reminding us that we have to celebrate even in the face of violence. I'm Brian Siegel, Director of AJC's Miami and Broward office. As the number of Jews attacked grows rapidly across the United States, including here in South Florida, as we just heard, and around the world, the reaction should be simple: outrage and action. But the silence is deafening. We're grateful to those who have spoken up against anti-Semitism, like the members of Congress with us today, but too many have been silent. Although anti-Semitism is the world's oldest hatred, it has morphed and modernized, plaguing society in new and insidious ways, including anti-Semitic rhetoric veiled as criticism of Israel. This hate is unacceptable and inaction is inexcusable. Anti-Semitism is a problem for our entire society and threatens our values and our democracy. So we want to know, where is the outrage? That's why we at American Jewish Committee have launched #Where'sTheOutrage, a social media campaign that aims to mobilize people of goodwill to speak out against the horrific targeting of Jews. The growth of anti-Semitism here in the US is also why we at AJC established a US office for combating anti-Semitism. We commissioned a detailed State of Anti-Semitism report, surveying attitudes in the US about anti-Semitism, and created a wealth of resources online at our website, ajc.org. History has taught us that silence and indifference are never the answer. This is a defining moment in time when leaders must speak out now and carry the message that anti-Semitism in all its forms is unacceptable. I'm now honored to introduce one such leader who stood up and spoken out, Congressman Carlos Jimenez. As the mayor of Miami-Dade County and now a member of Congress, Representative Jimenez has stood with Israel and the Jewish community. He's traveled to Israel, secured investments for Israeli businesses in Miami, was instrumental in securing a direct flight from Miami to Tel Aviv. And we're grateful for the leadership he's shown in Washington in just a few short months in defense of Israel and against anti-Semitism. On a personal note, I'm proud that Congressman Jimenez went to Israel on AJC's Project Interchange and has been a good friend. Congressman Jimenez, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that. And I've been to Israel twice, and I hope to go back in August again with some members of Congress. And a lot of them, the freshman class, probably have never been to Israel, so they can see firsthand why it's so important that we stand with Israel. You know, the spike in anti-Semitism, coupled with the recent terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel, really underscores the need for the United States to make a firm bipartisan commitment to both the state of Israel and the Jewish people. For that reason, I introduced a resolution in the House of Representatives to condemn the terrorist attacks from Hamas and to reaffirm our crucial support for the U.S.-Israeli alliance. To date, the resolution has received support from 83 members of Congress, and that number continues to grow day by day. Most strikingly, however, is lack of support of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I hope that that can be rectified soon. Despite our efforts made by staff to reach out to members from the other side, nobody has joined this resolution as of yet. We firmly believe that congressional support for Israel should not be a partisan action. That is why this resolution does 4 simple things. First, the resolution condemns the acts of terrorism committed by Hamas against the people of the state of Israel. Hamas, an extremist organization recognized by the Department of State as a terrorist group since 1997, is responsible for reprehensible military attacks on Israeli civilians and proven to use innocent Palestinians as human shields. The resolution's condemnation of Hamas stays within the scope of current U.S. foreign policy. Second, the resolution recognizes Jerusalem as the legitimate capital city of Israel. Also in line with current U.S. foreign policy, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital city is a crucial element of Israel's self-determination as a state. Politically, the highest seats of Israeli government are located in Jerusalem, including the Knesset, Israeli Supreme Court, the Prime Minister's residence. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, from the beginning of the Biden administration, has honored this foreign policy as evidenced by the United States maintaining our embassy in Jerusalem. Third, the resolution supports Israel's efforts of self-determination and collective security against external forces. As a free and sovereign state, Israel has the right to provide its self-defense and maintain its own laws independent of the wills of international organizations and multinational agencies. Prominent Democrats in the past have been supportive of Israel's exercise of sovereignty, with Speaker Pelosi coming forward this week defending Israel's right to protect itself from Hamas terrorists. Fourth, the resolution reaffirms support for policies and initiatives combating anti-Semitic behavior around the world. Since the onset of World War II, it has been the foreign policy of the United States to, quite frankly, a central tenet of the modern liberal world to support efforts to end anti-Semitism. The most radical fringes of the political spectrum do not represent the majority of America, especially when it comes to the defense of our most important ally in the Middle East. Their attacks against Israel are indefensible and full of mistruths. It is my hope that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle will reject what these radical fringes say and come together on this issue. Never again is a phrase we use to cement our determination to protect the Jewish people around the world. And at a time when terrorists are threatening the existence of Israel, Democrats and Republicans, we all should be willing to join at a table for reaffirmation of that commitment. I am proud to stand with Israel and proud to stand with the Jewish people. I will always fight to ensure this Congress supports Israel and ensures this Congress works to combat anti-Semitism wherever and whenever we see it. I invite all members of Congress, Democrat and Republican alike, to join me in this efforts. And thank you for inviting me to this forum. And again, like I said, I look forward to going back to that beautiful state of Israel in the month of August.
Thank you, Congressman Jimenez, and thank you for your leadership. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Levin, CEO of the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County. And before I begin, I just wanted to give a special shout out to Ike Fisher and Jacob Solomon and the Miami Federation for putting this together and showing your incredible leadership of the South Florida Jewish community. At our Federation, our board chair, Larry Feldman, and the director of their Jewish Community Relations Council, Helene Paul, I want to thank you for your continued support of Jewish communities and the preservation of the state of Israel. Israel's founding Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, made a statement that remains remarkably prescient even today. He said, "Let me first tell you one thing. It doesn't matter what the world says about Israel. It doesn't matter what they say about us anywhere else. The only thing that matters is that we can exist here on the land of our forefathers. And unless we show the Arabs that there is a higher price to pay for murdering Jews, we won't survive." Today's issues remain the same. No country in the world can have missiles raining on its citizens. America, Canada, the UK, France, Australia, the list goes on. Not one democracy on the globe would accept it. But unfortunately, in 2001, we as Jews see anti-Semitism now, not just in global conflict, but on the extremes of our political landscape. We see it in our communities. We see it in academia, media, yes, from the words of some woefully ignorant elected leaders on both sides of the aisle. But yet we are both heartened and strengthened by this demonstration of partnership and friendship as we confront this shocking rise in anti-Semitism. But it underscores that the lessons of the diaspora remain: advocacy, education, and the knowledge that our cause is just and fair. I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, our ally, U.S. Congressman Ted Deutsch. Ted has been a good friend and continues to be a stalwart supporter of the Jewish Federation and of the many Jewish constituents who reside in its district. Over the past 10 years in Washington, and for even longer before that, Congressman Deutsch has been a leader and a champion on the issues we all care about. In his role as the chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee, many of the critical pieces of legislation in support of Israel and the Jewish community are literally written on his desk. He has been outspoken over the past 2 weeks during this conflict on social media and on the House floor, especially in support of Israel. Ted, thank you for your work and your commitment towards maintaining a strong, productive U.S.-Israel relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you Congressman Ted Deutsch.
Matt, thank you very much. I'm incredibly honored to be with everyone here today. I want to thank Jacob and Mark as well. I want to thank the leadership that pulled this together, and I want to, more than anything else, acknowledge the presence and the deep support for the U.S.-Israel relationship and for combating anti-Semitism that my colleagues bring to this meeting today. Senator Scott and Representative Jimenez, Representative Mast, Representative Wasserman Schultz, Representative Frankel, and I are, I think, indicative of not just what happens in this community, but what happens in Congress overall, which is the coming together in a broad bipartisan way to stand up for Israel when Israel's under attack, and to stand up for the Jewish community when the Jewish community is under attack. And in South Florida, this is something that hits particularly close to home for all of us. I know that there's a big audience, a big crowd on this event, at this event today. And it's important to remember that, and I say this as a former board member of my federation, board member and officer of my federation, just as my wife is now, someone who's been deeply involved in the Jewish community, pro-Israel community my entire life. For all of you who are not in the panel, for all of you who are not speaking but are participating, it is your support, your leadership, your commitment to standing with our broader community that makes this possible. I'm so grateful to live the leadership here with the AJC and ADL that I see on here. Mario Diaz-Balart, I didn't acknowledge before, I see is on. This is what we do here. And this is why we all understand, as I said on the House floor, that this is a moment of moral clarity. When Israel faced 4,300 rockets from Hamas, this was not an issue of anything other than whether we stand with our friend and ally, the Jewish and democratic state of Israel, or whether, as some have suggested, there is some reason to accept as legitimate the firing of rockets indiscriminately meant to kill as many Israeli civilians as possible by a terrorist group, Hamas. I stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. That's what my colleagues and I do. That's what our community does. And at the same moment, as we've come through this in a bipartisan way, let's also acknowledge that just as we have come together in a bipartisan way, Secretary Blinken, just in Israel this week, reaffirmed the strong US support for Israel's right to defend itself. President Biden made clear in his conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu the very fact that he is going to ensure that Israel has plenty of iron, that the stockpile for Iron Dome is replenished, and that all of this happens because of the strong bipartisan support for Israel in the country. And I'll finish with this. Matt, we have worked together for a long time. I actually have worked with so many of you for a long time. And what we've seen over the past few days in our own country, and I say this as a member of our community and the co-chair of the bipartisan task force to combat anti-Semitism, something that was an organization that was formed when there were attacks on Jews in other countries. What we have seen in the attacks on our community here is abhorrent, must be condemned. And there must be, Brian, there must be outrage. And if you can't hear it from me, understand I and my colleagues are outraged. That's why Debbie led an effort to speak out. That's why we're looking for as many ways to speak out in support of the community and against these violent attacks as we can. And that's why this day and this event is so important. I thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm immensely grateful for the leadership of the federations that have been involved, for the organizations who've been involved, but most importantly, I'm so immensely grateful for the community that I'm so proud to call home. Thanks very, very much.
Representative Deutsch, you are a great friend. You're a great congressman. Your work in service of our nation is important. Your work in service of within your party to ensure continued strong wall-to-wall support for Israel, the heavy lifting that you're doing on behalf of the relationship and in support of our community is enormously appreciated. We now have the pleasure of hearing from Senator Marco Rubio. Senator Rubio, first of all, thanks for adjusting your schedule in order to join us. I hardly think I need to say it, but for the last 12 years, Senator Rubio has been an extraordinary leader and a champion of the United States-Israel relationship and of the Jewish community. As a member of the Senate Appropriations and Foreign Relations Committees, which, as everyone knows, are two of the most important bodies that really shape and oversee the relationship between the United States and Israel, he is critically involved in making sure that our country stands strong with Israel. And we are enormously grateful for his statements, his legislative action in defense of Israel's right to defend herself, and of course, against the alarming and pernicious rise of anti-Semitism. I just want to say on a personal note that more than the formal support for Israel that we hear from Senator Rubio practically every day, he really gets Israel. He gets it not just in his head, but in his heart. And we are very, very grateful to have him as our good friend. Senator Rubio, please.
Well, look, I thank you for including me, and I apologize if I have to be a bit brief here. I've got a speech scheduled on the floor potentially now and things of this nature, but this is a very important topic, and I'm sorry that I have to join it simply because of the events that have occurred that make us join it. I think there are two issues here that are interrelated. I know many of your speakers that have been on already have talked about it, and so I don't want to be repetitive, but clearly we all, I think it's really important for those of us in this position to explain clearly what it is and why it is what's happening in Israel is occurring. Hamas is a terrorist organization whose charter calls for the destruction of the Jewish state. They reward with bonuses and payments those who kill Jews living in Israel and attack Israel. They are well armed with sophisticated weaponry that they were not in the possession or in their arsenal just a decade ago, and as evidenced recently. And when they attack the way they did, one of the things they are trying to provoke is what they know is coming, a military response. And they embed their military operations within civilian populations. They do so deliberately for the purpose of ensuring that there is civilian death and loss of life, and then the press will attack Israel. That's one of the goals that they have, is to delegitimize Israel in the eyes of the world and to ultimately create a debate here in America about how strongly we should stand with Israel. Anything that happens here that sort of distances the United States from Israel actually feeds into the narrative that they're trying to pursue. The second issue related to that, of course, is they have an internal thing going on with the Palestinian Authority, which themselves are no saints. And so part of these attacks is to emerge from it victorious and appearing to be the stronger of the two parties. Suffice it to say that all the conditions that led to what we saw a few days ago, beginning a few days ago, are still in place. We're all happy to see that there's a ceasefire. I was pleased to see that Israel was able to significantly degrade Hamas's ability to attack, but much of that capability remains, and much of the factors that led to it are still in place. And so this requires continued vigilance and support and engagement on our behalf. The second, and very troubling, is the instances of anti-Semitism. This is an evil poison, ancient poison, that unfortunately finds adherents across the political spectrum, on both the far left and the far right, and it should be condemned in every shape and form that it exists. It's sad to see that not just increasing here domestically with some of the things we saw last week, but around the world, we've seen increasing instances of it. And I would argue that that some of the rhetoric you hear now in the international community about Israel is actually anti-Semitism around the world, disguised as anti-Israel foreign policy. But at the core of all this, and one of the things I always try to explain to people, is Israel's a very unique country. It was created by the international community to be a homeland for a people. It was created specifically for the purpose of being a Jewish homeland in the aftermath of the Holocaust. It was created by the international community for that exact purpose, so that never again would there not be somewhere in the world that Jewish people could go if they faced something like what happened in the late 1930s through the mid 1940s. And we need to remind people of that constantly, because it explains a lot of the policies and stances of the Israeli government and of our commitment to Israel's security and to its well-being. So I'm happy to see, like I said, look, we're in a very unique place in Florida, particularly in South Florida. We have a delegation that's strongly united on these topics. I think this issue is, American support for Israel is always strongest when it is bipartisan and bicameral. And I certainly think that's the case in our own delegation. And I think you've seen that both in this call and in our work in years past. And I think we'll continue to see in years moving forward. And like I said, I know we have a great lineup of speakers here today, so I don't want to take any more of your time, but I just thank you for the chance to speak to you for a few minutes.
Thank you, Senator Rubio, for your steadfast support. I'm Brett Sandala, representing the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's Jewish Community Relations Council. Our federation is doing everything we can to ensure the care and safety of our extended Jewish family, and has been in close contact with our partners on the ground in Israel, including the Jewish Agency and the Joint Distribution Committee. They are constantly assessing and making us aware of needs related to trauma, emergency shelter, and repair of homes and community buildings. Our partnership region, Tzachar, includes the cities Tzfat, Rosh Pinah, and Hatzor Haglilit in the north of Israel, and has seen civil unrest and significant trauma in recent weeks. We've opened a dedicated emergency fund to provide urgent trauma care throughout Israel, encouraged our community to send messages of support to our friends in our partner region, and work to provide educational resources and support to our local community. In the face of anti-Semitic attacks inspired in part by widespread lies and misinformation on the conflict, we've encouraged the community to educate themselves further on the complex issues at play, including through our presentation on anti-Semitism today, while remaining vigilant and taking all appropriate precautions to protect ourselves through the Federation's J-Secure program. On behalf of our Federation, thanks to our government representatives and neighboring federations for hosting this event. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Representative Brian Mast of Florida's 18th Congressional District. As the only member of Congress to ever serve in the Israel Defense Forces, no one knows the challenges facing Israel and the threat of Iran better than Congressman Mast. In his 5 years in Washington and as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, he's been a staunch supporter of Israel and the Jewish community, speaking out strongly and forcefully in support of the Jewish state and against anti-Semitism at home and abroad. Thank you for your support and for your service, and welcome, Representative Mast.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for everybody, my colleagues on both sides for getting on this call. There's a really old saying that probably everybody's heard, which is actions speak louder than words. And you look at the actions of what goes on in the Gaza Strip, and you have to ask, how does that mesh with their words? When you look at the hundreds of attacks by Hamas, by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, by Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and so many others by so many other names, when you think of the bus bombings, the market bombings, the bombings at checkpoints, the bombings in various stores, the bombing in restaurants, in cafes, in so many places. When you think of the stabbings, the vehicular manslaughter, the kidnappings, the rocket attacks on top of that, those are the actions that have to be spoken out about and cannot be rewarded. And the world has to know what those actions are, not just the actions in 2021, but the rocket attacks, the literally all of the rocket attacks that went on before this was making the news just a couple of weeks ago, because there was thousands of rockets coming in. The 40 rockets that came in the month of April, the hundreds of rockets that came in the year of 2020, and those that came in the year 2019 and 2018, that this is a regular occurrence. This isn't something just happened as a one-off. The world needs to know this isn't one pissed off Palestinian with an RPG over their shoulder that's lobbing it 100 yards towards Israel. This is a sophisticated network that is conducting terrorism year after year, not in just one way, but in many different ways. They're firing rockets that in many cases are the size or larger than Chevy Suburbans, with hundreds of pounds of explosives attached to the end of them. They're not funded by bake sales. They're funded by a sophisticated network that gets them all the way from places like Iran, across Syria, across other places, into where they're firing these rockets from, and it needs to be addressed accordingly. You've heard many of the colleagues speaking about pieces of legislation that they have in order to address some of these things. Likewise, I have legislation in the same way. It was passed last Congress. We've been trying to move it through this Congress to address things like how you're going to sanction them. And as we say, actions speak louder than words. It's important to recognize that as members of the House of Representatives and members of the Senate, there are actions that only we can take as lawmakers. There's things that only we can do, and those actions have to be far louder than our words, because we were put into the places that say we will take those actions. We won't just speak. We won't just talk on the floor of the House of Representatives. We will pass meaningful legislation to bring this to an end, to protect our faith-based places of worship and schools and other places here on the homeland. And if we're not passing those things, then we are failing. We are failing if you are planning before ceasefires are even announced to start rebuilding infrastructure in Palestinian territories, in Gaza. If you're planning to rebuild their infrastructure before you're even planning to go out there and hold those accountable for that, that is a real problem of action, and that has to be fixed within our lawmaking bodies right now. If they're working already to say, we're going to not pass legislation to sanction Hamas, but consider passing legislation or not sign off on arms agreements that were already agreed upon for Israel, not sign off on those because of what's going on over there, Israel defending herself, that is a wrong action. And it's literally a sanction on Israel when no sanctions were addressed on Hamas during the entire breadth of these attacks. Our actions have to speak louder than our words. And until they do, we're going to continue to see the kind of attacks that we go out there and we speak against, but are not doing everything possible with our actions in order to prevent. So in that, I look forward to working with my colleagues to make sure that we can come back together at another time and be able to look all of you honestly in the eye and say, you know what, we can stand in front of you, ask to represent you again with this assurance by saying, we should get that opportunity again because we proved our actions will speak louder than our words. We're not just full of rhetoric. And in that, I hope that we can come together on that. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Representative Mast, for your kind words and your unwavering support of the State of Israel and the Jewish community. My name is Yael Hirschfield, and I'm the Interim Regional Director for the Florida region of ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. We are an organization with more than 100 years in existence fighting anti-Semitism and working to secure just and fair treatment for all. The ADL audit of anti-Semitic incidents recorded a spike of 40% in 2020 in Florida compared to the previous year. And now we're recording anti-Semitic incidents on a daily basis here, across the country and abroad, as it relates to the conflict in Israel. Capturing this data is of utmost importance. If we are to understand the extent of the problem, we need to have everyone reporting them to law enforcement when appropriate and to ADL at adl.org/reportincident. Many have said it already, but it bears repeating. Whenever anti-Israel actions target synagogues, Jewish community centers, kosher restaurants, Jewish-owned businesses, or individual Jews, in other words, we're holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's actions, ADL considers such incidents as anti-Semitic. These actions intimidate Jews and prevent them from living openly and freely as Jews. To those in positions of leadership who have used this conflict between Israel and the terrorist group Hamas to exacerbate tensions with their inflammatory rhetoric, we say, your words have consequences. To social media companies that allow a flurry of misinformation and hate to be widely shared on their platforms, we say, your inaction has consequences. The assaults against the Jewish community do not comport with American values. We need to be clear and unequivocal. Hate against the Jewish community is un-American. ADL strongly supports the State of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. From a personal note, my father was born there in 1927 after his family left Poland. My mother arrived as a 1-year-old in 1935 from Romania. Their families had left those countries because their safety as Jews was threatened. As a young married couple, they embarked in an adventure that brought them to Venezuela, where I was born. After more than 50 years there, my mother, my sibling, and nieces left once anti-Semitism flourished under government sponsorship. Israel was the refuge. Israel, the ancient home of Jewish people that continues to this day to be a refuge for so many. That is why supporting the legitimacy of the State of Israel is not only vital to ADL, but it's also very personal to me. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Lois Frankel, who represents District 21. Congresswoman Frankel has a long history of supporting Israel and the Jewish community, and we're grateful for her leadership. She put out incredibly supportive statements and spoke forcefully on the House floor defending Israel over the past 2 weeks. And in her role as a member of the Appropriations Committee, worked to ensure ongoing US financial support for Israel, including critical funding for Iron Dome.
Thank you so much. I want to start by saying I am a proud Jew. So this is personal to me. My colleagues and others have said many very intelligent comments, and I truly will be short because not to repeat, but just to say amen to what so many have said. Thank you to our local Jewish federations and the ADL, ICAJC, and other organizations for bringing us together, and my congressional colleagues of both parties for standing together against anti-Semitism, which is surging in the United States and around the world. This hate is unacceptable. Inaction is inexcusable, and bipartisanship is so important. I'll make it clear again, I've said this many times, But I stand with Israel's right to defend itself from the Hamas terrorists who have fired recently hundreds of rockets into Israel, causing harm both to Israelis and Palestinians. And but for the Iron Dome system, which my colleagues and I on this call today will stand to continue to fund, there would have been so much more death and morbidity. And I want to urge folks who follow these, what's been going on, that it's important to separate domestic Israeli policies that you may or may not agree with from the Hamas terrorists who have openly sought the destruction of Israel. And we saw what they have done just in the past couple of weeks. So I join my colleagues on this call. I will stand with Israel. I will stand up to make sure that the United States continues our commitment for funding, for military funding, for the Iron Dome. And we have all learned from history that silence is fatal. And I join you all again to say I condemn anti-Semitism, and I stand with Israel, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Franco. Your work within the party and across the aisle in support of Israel really makes a difference, and we're very, very grateful. Continue to be strong, please. We need you. So we're coming to the last few speakers. We have some additional elected officials whom I'm delighted were able to join us. And I want to start actually by welcoming a dear friend, Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart. Isn't it wonderful to be able to introduce every one of our elected officials as stalwart and unwavering in support of Israel and in support of the relationship that the United States has with our Jewish homeland? Congressman Diaz-Balart knows the threats facing Israel very well, and he understands the threats facing the Jewish community equally well. He's also a member of the Appropriations Committee, an advocate and a leader for foreign assistance to Israel, including Iron Dome. The congressman's always ready to lend his passionate and forceful voice at rallies and community meetings in support of Israel, and I'm delighted to ask Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart to share some words.
Well, thank you so very much. What a privilege to be with you and with all of my colleagues. I don't want to repeat what was already said, so I want to make a few points. Number one, that this is when it matters. You can't claim to be supporting Israel and then abandon Israel when the missiles are raining down. Number one. And so this is the moment when we must stand with Israel like never before. Number two, if anybody still is confused about the evil that is the Iranian regime and the damage that it does and how we need to continue to sanction that regime, and you want to know where the money is that they've gotten? Well, just look at the missiles raining down on Israel. Number three, we must fight anti-Semitism everywhere and anywhere it raises its ugly head. And we can never let falsehoods, attacks against the Jewish people or against the Jewish state of Israel stand. And fourth, on a congressional level, you know that we will be united, fighting for the funding that it needs, but to also make sure that there's no confusion. For all of the enemies of Israel and the enemies of the United States, which are one and the same, the United States stands 1,000% with Israel. We will do what needs to be done to make sure that first, these terrorists are brought to justice, these murderers are brought to justice, and number two, that Israel has whatever she needs to defend herself, to defend its people. So again, look, it's a privilege to be with all of you. This is an important moment, and just know that there's unity in the Florida delegation, but I'm so proud, particularly of the South Florida delegation. And to every one of you, thank you for your steadfast support. Thank you for standing firm. It's a privilege to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Congressman Diaz-Balart. I hope that you're in the passenger seat and not in the driver's seat right there. But your support is amazing. And for our last elected official, I'm delighted to introduce Maria Elvira Salazar, who in just a few short months in Washington has emerged as a very strong supporter of Israel and the US-Israel relationship. We're very, very grateful. She's a constant presence on social media, on the House floor, and in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Very glad to know and to see that you're feeling well, Representative. And we are looking forward to your continued forceful leadership on this issue and other things that we can work together on. So Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, please. Oh, did we lose the Congresswoman?
We were waiting for the login, but we haven't gotten it yet.
Okay, so let's just wait for a few more seconds with the hopes that she is able to join us. So I want you all to hold that introduction in your minds, and we're going to go ahead with the program in the hopes that the Congresswoman will be able to join us. We had scheduled the agenda so that following the elected officials, we wanted to hear from the representative of the State of Israel to our community. As probably many of you know, we've had a series of interim consuls general because of the governmental fluidity, shall we say, in Israel. It's been a while since we've had a permanent individual in that seat. Our good friend Lior Hayat took over as the spokesman for the foreign ministry. He's doing a great job, and he sends his regards to everyone. In the meantime, we have an old friend, I mean an experienced friend, not an old friend, but Revital Malka, who is here now as the interim consul general for just a few more days, I'm afraid, is back. Revital actually served as the deputy head of mission at the Consulate General of Israel in Miami back in 2011 to 2015 or 16. She's a great friend to our community and an effective diplomat in service to the relationship. Revital, would you please say a few words on behalf of our beloved Israel?
Oh my God. Thank you, Jacob, and thank you to the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for putting together this highly important event. It really warms my heart. I want to thank the bipartisan support by the elected officials from Florida for your passionate, vocal, and unwavering standing strong with Israel and Israel's right to defend itself during the recent events in the region, when thousands of rockets were fired indiscriminately on civilian population by the Hamas. Israel has no better friend than the United States. As you all know, we reached a ceasefire, but the real battle continues here on the soil of the United States. Anti-Semitism is escalating and raising its head, but no more. The slogan "Never Again" is not said for nothing. It's said after 6 million of our people perished in the Holocaust. The Jewish communities in the United States are larger, more cohesive, stronger, and prouder. One must not sit quietly on the face of anti-Semitic incidents and expressions of hatred. Here, you are all the Iron Dome of the Jewish people, and we ask you to act against anti-Semitism, incitement, and hatred on the ground and in social media. We do not hate anyone. It is not in our lexicon. It is not in our values. As one of the 10 commandments says, and love for your neighbor as yourself. This is the value that leads us regardless of religion or race. Now is also the time to educate the younger generations to be more active and to strengthen their connection to Israel, as well as to incorporate more content into the Florida public schools to teach our youth about the horrors of the Holocaust and the dangers of hatred. I want to remind you all about the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism. We seek to embrace this definition across the states, municipalities, academic institutions, and much more. I call all of you to promote the ARA definition of anti-Semitism in your communities. Again, I truly appreciate the strong support from Florida elected officials, governor, lieutenant governor, the Senate, the House, commissioners, mayors, Jewish and Christians organizations. The state of Florida expressed condemnation of Hamas as terrorist organization and showed their unwavering support for Israel's right to defend itself. I can personally say that I'm fortunate to be an Israeli diplomat in Florida. It warmed my heart to hear all your comments. You are all true friends. Thank you.
Revital, I know that you're going back to Israel in a few days, but whether as an official in the consulate or just a friend, you know that you're always welcome. Thank you very, very much for joining us. So I understand that Congresswoman Salazar is not able to join us. Is that correct? Okay, well, I'm sure she sends her regards, and we will express our regrets as well, and we're appreciative to her for her support. So we're getting into the home stretch now, and I'm delighted as we get to the second to the last speaker to call on a good friend, Rabbi Rachel Greengrass. Rabbi Greengrass has been part of the clergy team at Temple Beth Am in South Miami-Dade County since 2008, I believe. She is an award-winning social justice activist. She's the chair of the CCAR, which is the Rabbinical Association of the Reform Movement's Resolutions Committee, and she currently serves as the president of the Rabbinical Association of Greater Miami. She's a great speaker and a great friend. Rabbi, please.
Thank you so much. So it is my honor to offer a prayer in this moment. Yotzer HaMe'oroch, creator of lights, give us light now as we are experiencing the darkness of anti-Semitism. Give us friends to stand with us, stand up for us, and stand against hate. In Pirkei Avot 3:14, Rabbi Akiva teaches, beloved is man, for he was created in the image of God. Still greater was God's love in that God gave to man the knowledge of his having been so created. Hamerachem, our comforter, we thank you for every person who has come today to stand in solidarity with the Jewish community. The comfort they have given us by letting us know we are not alone is such a gift. We want to thank you for these representatives who truly see your image in the Jewish people. In Sifrei Kedoshim, Rabbi Akiva argues, you shall love your neighbor as yourself is the most important principle of the Torah. Ben Azai says, an even greater principle is these are the generations of Adam. Avinu, our divine parent, we pray for a day when all humanity sees that we are all children of Adam, that we are brothers and sisters, all one family. And when we hurt others, we are hurting ourselves. When we hate others, we are allowing them to taint our souls. Pray Olam, creator of the world, help us to create a better world, a world where the only thing we hate is bigotry, and the only thing we fight is for justice. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom, v'hamidenu shomrenu l'chaim, ufros aleinu sukat shlomecha. This is a prayer we say before we lie down to sleep at night, and it speaks to us today. It acknowledges our fears, our vulnerability, and our trust in God's loving presence. While the Jewish people are being attacked both through words and actions, while the only country in the world that welcomes Jew without question, our ancestral homeland, our beloved state of Israel is threatened, we promise to do all we can to speak up and show up. And we ask for God's protection and put our trust in God's sheltering presence. Grant, O God, that we lie down in peace and rise us up, O guardian, to life renewed. Spread over us the shelter of your peace. Guide us with your good counsel. For your name's sake, be our help. Shield and shelter us beneath the shadow of your wings. Defend us against enemies, illness, war, famine, and sorrow. Distance us from wrongdoing. For you, God, watch over us and deliver us. For you, God, are gracious and merciful. Guard our going and our coming. to life and peace forevermore.
Thank you, Rabbi Greengrass, for those beautiful words. I'm Tracy Spiegelman, the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council at the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. We are so grateful to have had over 1,200 attendees here with us from all over South Florida during this important town hall briefing with our elected officials. It is clear that standing together against anti-Semitism and in support of Israel is a bipartisan effort. Thank you. Thank you, thank you to all of our elected officials who spoke today. We are so grateful for your support, your actions, and service on behalf of our communities. If you have not received, this is to all of our attendees and our panelists, if you have not yet received notice, please plan to gather with us at an interfaith community rally against anti-Semitism. Thursday, June 3rd, thank you, at 6 p.m. at the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach. We will observe all COVID guidelines, CDC guidelines regarding COVID. Thank you again to all of our elected officials for your continued support and service. Thank you to our partner agencies who participated today in this town hall briefing. Thank you all for attending.